Good morning, students. Today we can discuss about gauge. Okay, so I have explained in the last class what is gauge. Gauge is defined as the minimum distance between inner face of two rails. Okay, so the distance between inner face of two rail is known as gauge. So Indian Railways follows this standard practice, and the gauge is measured as the clear minimum distance between the running face of two rails, as in the figure. Okay, it is not the center to center distance, it is the distance between inner face of two rails. Okay, that is followed by our Indian Railways. And this table shows various gauges which is provided in our world. Okay, so standard gauge means the gauge distance or the distance between the inner face of the rail is 1435 mm or 1.435 meters. Okay, and this standard gauge is provided around 62% of the total length of railway in the world. This is the gauges which is provided in worldwide or world railways. Okay, so this table shows the percentage of total length provided by this gauge. So standard gauge is provided as 62% of the total length of the rail in the world, and this standard gauge is provided in countries like England, USA, Canada, Turkey, Persia and China. Okay, next one is standard gauge, and standard gauge means the gauge distance is 1.676 meters or 1676 meters, and this is the most used gauge in India. Okay, so this broad gauge is provided 6% of the total railway, and the countries which are providing or following this broad gauge is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Argentina. And next is broad gauge. The another length of broad gauge is 1524, which is provided in Russia and Finland. In India, the length of broad gauge is 1.676 meters. And another type is Cape gauge, and the gauge length is 1067 mm or 1.067 meters. It is provided in these countries. Next is meter gauge. Meter gauge means the gauge distance is 1000 mm or 1 meter, and it is in total percentage is 9% of the total railway length, and it is provided in India also, India, France, Switzerland and Argentina. And 23 various other gauges are provided and in different countries, because these types of these special type of gauges are provided in special types of topography like hilly regions, mountains, valleys, etc. Okay, so this will be provided in every country based on the topography. Okay, so these are the various types of gauges on world railways. Next table shows the various gauges on Indian Railways, and this data is from 2011. Okay, so these types of gauges are provided in India. They are broad gauge, meter gauge and narrow gauge. Broad gauge means the total or the distance between two rails is 1.676 meters, and the total of 55,188 kilometer is provided in broad gauge. That is 85% of the total railway in India is in broad gauge. Okay, next meter gauge means 1000 mm or 1 meter is the distance between two rails, and it is 6809 kilometers of our Indian railway, that is 10%. Narrow gauge means 762 mm or 610 mm. Both are under narrow gauge classification. So this is only 3.8%. So total route length is 64,460. On this total route length, around 55,000 kilometers in broad gauge. So in India, most of the railway track is in broad gauge system. Okay, so in the case of broad gauge, the distance between two rails are 1.676 meters. So next we can discuss about types of gauges or individual gauges. The different gauges which are provided in there: broad gauge, meter gauge and narrow gauge. First one, broad gauge. Okay, here the clear distance between the inner face of two parallel rails which is forming a track is 1676 mm, and this is also known as standard gauge of India, and is the broadest gauge of the world. And other countries which are using this broad gauge are Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Argentina, etc. And 50% of India's railway track have been laid to this gauge. Next is the suitability for broad gauge. Okay, So under what conditions we are using broad gauge? So broad gauge are suitable under the following conditions. That is, when sufficient funds are available for railway project, we are adopting broad gauge. So in the case of broad gauge, the distance will be somewhat wider. So if sufficient fund is available, we can adopt broad gauge. Okay, and this gauge is therefore used for tracks in plain areas or which are densely populated. That is for routes of maximum traffic intensities and at places which are centers of industry and commerce. So at these situations we are providing broad gauge. Okay. Next is meter gauge. Here the clear distance between inner face of two parallel rails which is forming the track is 1000 mm or 1 meter. So it is known as meter gauge. And the other countries which are using meter gauge are France, Switzerland, Argentina. Then 40% of India's railway track is laid in meter gauge system. And conditions at which we are providing the meter gauge are, when first one, when funds are available for railway project are inadequate. If the fund available is not much sufficient for providing a broad gauge, we are using meter gauge. Okay. And when the prospects of revenue are not very bright. So in these conditions we are using meter gauge. So the conditions at which we cannot provide broad gauge only, we are adopting the meter gauge. Okay, so usually we are providing broad gauge system, and if the fund is not sufficient for providing broad gauge, we are using meter gauge. The last type is narrow gauge. Here the clear distance between the inner face of two parallel rails forming a track is either 762 mm or 610 mm. Okay. And the other countries which are using narrow gauge, Britain, South Africa, etc. And only 10% of India's railway track have been laid to narrow gauge. And the narrow gauge is suitable under following conditions. First one, when the construction of a track with wider gauge is prohibited due to provision of sharp curves, steep gradients, narrow bridge and tunnels. That is situations where we have to provide sharp curves or steep gradients, narrow bridges and tunnels, etc. We have to provide narrow gauge. At these situations we cannot go for broad gauge or meter gauge. Okay, so this gauge is used in hilly and very thinly populated areas. Okay, so in hilly regions we are providing narrow gauge only. Okay, we cannot provide broad gauge at that situation. And also when the prospects of the revenue are not very bright, we are going for narrow gauge. Okay, so narrow gauge is usually provided for worst topographical conditions like hilly region and or very thinly populated areas, and if there is any sharp curves, steep gradients, narrow bridges, tunnels, etc. Okay, in these situations we are using narrow gauge. Okay, so these are the different types of gauges in India. They are broad gauge. Broad gauge means the distance between two rails are 1.676 meters or 1676 mm. Then in the case of meter gauge it is 1000 mm or 1 meter, and narrow gauge it is 762 mm or 610 mm. Next is the uniformity of gauge. Uniformity of gauge means one country should have only one gauge throughout its various parts. That is the uniformity of gauge. That is, in India, all the gauge distance should be same. Okay, in all the railway track, the gauge distance should be same. But the policy of India is, and its topographical, geological and financial conditions have led to adopt various gauges in its different parts. But even though we have to provide same type of gauges in every part, we cannot do like that, because since there is variation of topography, geology and financial conditions, we have to adopt different types of gauges. Okay, in that situation only we are providing for non-uniformity of gauges, because the topography varies. That is, in hilly region we cannot go for broad gauge. In hilly region we are providing narrow gauge. Like that, financial condition also varies. If the fund available is very less, we cannot go for broad gauge. In that situation we are adopting narrow gauge or meter gauge. Usually meter gauge. Narrow gauge is usually provided for worst topographical situations. Okay. So actually, or theoretically, the gauges which is the gauge for one country should be uniform. Okay, but due to variations in topography, geology and financial condition, we have to go for different types of gauges in different regions. Okay, so these are about gauges. Okay, so thank you.